Okay, good morning, everybody. It's 10:35. We're about 60% attendance for who signed up, so we will go ahead and start. As I said, good morning from the Broward MPO and my team here. This is Funding Our Future Federal Grants, and it's part of the Broward MPO's Educational Workshop Series. My name is Brian Koleka. I'm the Director of Transportation. Today, we have gathered our in-house and external talent to provide an overview of the federal grant application process. As a federally funded regional transportation planning organization representing more than 30 member governments, the Broward MPO is in a unique position to coordinate, collaborate, and educate leaders and officials from across the region on key topics in our region moving forward. A key component to achieving this mission of the MPO is identifying projects and prioritizing funding for the capital improvements necessary to address the infrastructure and transportation needs of our region. Federal grants are a funding option, and with the right amount of planning, regional cooperation, and combined resources, securing millions of dollars for our shared goals is possible. By holding this workshop, we hope to not just provide your teams with new information on various grant programs, but also to foster conversations now and in the future on the importance of planning ahead to achieve our collective goals by working together as regional partners and preparing for the responsibilities that come with being awarded federal grant funding. We have a presentation prepared to you today that will walk you through each phase of the grant application process, from the project identification, technical preparation of all the application materials, promoting your application, and how the MPO fits into each step. There will be opportunities to ask questions in the question and answer box below. After each segment, we will address the questions and concerns you submit, followed by an open discussion at the end if time is permitting. Thank you very much for attending today. We hope you enjoy. Mr. Calvarisi.
Thank you, Mr. Koleka. So before we get into this, Mr. Sloom is going to give us some housekeeping rules on how we can have a successful webinar today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jad Salim. I'm Government Relations and Transportation Planner for the Broward MPO. We have a great presentation today with a bunch of great speakers and a fantastic audience. I'm going to be facilitating the question and answer portion. We're going to have a series of segments and then time in between for questions. Please put any questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and then we will select from there and answer the questions live on the video. If you have any follow-ups or any private questions that you'd like, we are available to answer them. Paul Cavaresi's contact information will be available at the end, and we'd be happy to answer any of your questions after the presentation. We will be sending out a copy of the slides, the complete presentation. That'll be a link to our Broward MPO website, which you can view the presentation later, as well as a recording of the presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Chad. So thank you for joining us today. So this is, as Mr. Koleka said, this is part of our ongoing education series. And what we're doing here today is looking at how you can plan for grants. This is so that we're taking a proactive approach to funding our future infrastructure. So what's available? We'll be discussing federal grants mostly, but I just want to let you know that everything that we're discussing, all the documentation, the process, the data that go into the federal grants also apply to Broward MPO's competitive programs. So much of what you're seeing today applies not just to the specific federal transportation grants, but also internal programs, and a lot of what you can take away from today can also be applied across all federal grants. But for the most part, we'll be focusing on transportation, because if you've been following what's going on in the news, of the new infrastructure bill, there's about $500 billion in discretionary, meaning grant funding for infrastructure. And this is a large chunk of funding. And I really think it's something, or here at the Broward MPO, we really want to make sure that we're competitive to bring this money, not just to Florida, but to the residents of Broward County. So as we're going through this, we're asking you to take a goal-oriented approach. Okay, when you're considering your grants, what are the city's goals? And based on those goals, how do those fit into your plans? And then looking at your planning, cost estimates, public participation, which grants align with those? So we're going to be taking you through these sequentially. So let's say a grant comes through, or sorry, a grant comes out, the notice of funding opportunity. So when that comes out, if you're asking, hey, these are the questions you need to ask. Okay, does your project align with the criteria of the grant? Do the public benefits exceed the costs? Okay, do you have strong support for this, both public and private? Are there adequate matching funds? Okay, federal and non-federal. Now, by matching, we mean local funds to match federal, state funds to match federal, and all the permutations between. And then most importantly, do you have time and resources to apply? Typically, when these grants are announced, there's anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks to put together an application package. And that will consume a lot of staff resources. So as you're going through this, now, the notice of funding opportunity is when the grant is available. If that is when you start planning, you're already too late. And that's why we're doing this workshop. Because in order to submit these grants, you need to have the necessary documentation, such as your environmental risk approvals, your project schedule. You need quantifiable benefits, okay, supported by data. And you need to show that this is a project that's supported, okay, in your community. And most importantly, can you execute? If you win this grant, can you manage it? And can you deliver the project that you promised the federal government will fund with their portion of the money? Now, this will be covered more in depth later, but I just want to give an overview of what's in the grant application. Okay, you need a narrative. Can you tell a good, convincing story? Okay, and can you back that story up with data? You can't just bring anecdotal evidence. It needs to be documented. And then lastly, can that data lead to a benefit cost? Will the government see a return on their investment equal to or greater than what they put in? And all this needs to be documented with data and numerical values. So also when you're looking at the planning, okay, when it's time to apply, never wait until the deadline. Things go wrong. Okay, how many times has a website crashed on you? Okay, that happens all the time with grants.gov. You also need to make sure all your documents are gathered. And I would say even right now, if you don't have anybody trained on how to submit a grant through grants.gov, start training that person. And then also train their backup in case they're out sick that day. Make sure you have redundant systems because you don't want to go through several weeks, months, or even a year worth of work just to not be able to submit on a website on one day. And our partners at TransSystems will explain the process in greater detail later. So now you've applied. Does that mean you're done? No. One of the most important things to do on the back end is promoting your application. This is when your executives, your directors, and your elected officials will really come in handy. They will be the ones communicating with the congressional delegation and senators. You need to educate the congressional staff to promote the project up in Washington, D.C. Your directors and your high-level staff need to engage with the high-level staff at USDOT and the Florida Department of Transportation. Now, once again, we're talking about transportation grants. So if you're looking at a grant from Department of Energy, et cetera, apply that to those departments. And then like with all grants, make sure you have support, documented support in the form of letters. And since we're the modern age, drawing up buzz for this on a social media campaign will benefit. And once again, we're doing this as an overview, and our partners at Holland and Knight will go more in depth on what this looks like. So now, what are the Broward MPO's roles in this? Well, as the regional transportation planning entity throughout the county, we have the long-range planning tools available which already have projects documented. They have the necessary support, they have cost estimates, they're locally vetted, and they're already in our plans. So when you're looking for projects, this is the place that start. And Peter Gies will discuss this more in a second. Okay. Additionally, facilitation. Through our partnerships and working together in coordination, we can work throughout the municipalities, the state, and even at the federal level to make sure that everything is in line to have a successful grant. And most importantly, avoiding conflict. We don't want to cannibalize each other. We don't want to compete amongst each other for the same pot of funds. One of the worst things we can do is ask the federal government to prioritize our projects for us. We want to show that we are on a united front. So maybe it means this year that the cities are all, or our governing partners are all rallying around one project to receive a grant, and then next year it's somebody else's turn. Okay, that's how we create a successful region. Now, additionally with the Broward MPO's roles, okay, we are happy to work with you to submit grant applications, but what we're really looking for is a partnership. So first off, we need matching funds. These are federal grant opportunities that we're discussing, and the MPO is federally funded. We cannot match our funds, our federal funds, with other federal dollars. So we need partners who can bring local or state dollars to the table. We're also looking for staff resources. This is a partnership, so you know your community best. You have the data, you know your constituents. Okay, it needs to be a partnership between both our staff and yours. And on the data side, yes, we do have data resources, but we're also looking at you for the internal stuff. If you have anecdotal evidence, or for instance, if there's a if you're saying that a project will reduce crime, we need the crime statistics from your local police. And that will lead into the return on investment backup, where we can say reduction of crime will create this much return. And then the most importantly is the outreach. Okay, working with your residents and constituents to drum up support, and then documenting that support through letters. So I've known I've thrown a lot at you, but we're starting with our summary, and we're going to go more in depth throughout. So at this point, Chad, do we have any questions in the chat?
So far, no questions in the chat. I'll keep monitoring it, and we can go ahead, move on to Peter Gies.
All right, well, thank you for your time. I'd like to bring Peter Gies up.
Thank you very much. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So Paul, can you see that that screen there?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, great. So as Paul mentioned, my name is Peter Gies. I'm the Systems Planning Manager at the Broward MPO. And what that really means is I work a lot with my team on the long-range planning products, as well as our short-range planning products, specifically the Metropolitan Transportation Plan and the Transportation Improvement Program. Paul gave you a really great high-level overview of what is going to be needed for a grant. And I think step one in that process is making sure that we demonstrate planning consistency. As Paul mentioned, we don't necessarily want to be competing amongst ourselves for projects and for grants. And one of the ways that we do that is we look to our MPO adopted planning documents in order to demonstrate that planning consistency. So the goal of this presentation here is to show you where you can find those projects, why it's so important to utilize projects that are already included in the MPO plans, but then also an avenue for you to get your projects into an MPO adopted plan. So once again, that you can demonstrate that planning consistency, and we're showing a united front to the federal government. So I'm going to start off with an analogy here, and really that analogy is one of throwing spaghetti at the wall. We're all familiar with this, right? We often do this when we are trying to figure out ways to fund our projects, right? We're going to do anything and everything to get a project funded, and we're going to throw that project at every grant that is available. Unfortunately, with federal grants, the throwing spaghetti at the wall approach doesn't really work. So we have to ask ourselves, you know, in addition to seeing what sticks, you know, and just that being really the wrong approach, we need to ask, what kind of spaghetti are we going to use? What sort of sauce works best? What recipe ensures that the largest number of pieces are going to stick to the wall to make sure that we're going to get the right amount of funding that's needed, that it's the right grant that is going to work for that project? And so in short, what I'm trying to say here is you need to care about the quality of the project and its ability to be competitive for that particular grant. Now, that's not something that is just going to be decided by you all as a local agency. This is a partnership, right? As Paul has mentioned, we're going to work with you as a Broward MPO. We'll facilitate the conversations between the appropriate planning partners, whether that be the county or the state, and also with the local government. We have advocates at our disposal. So I really want you to keep this analogy in mind and think about, does this project really meet the intent of the grant? And is this a quality project? Is this something that our commission has been pursuing for a long time? We have all of the right information in order to move this project forward, and that it's included in a lot of the MPO's planning documents. So I just wanted to touch on the MPO's core products here before I move on, because these are the places where you're going to be looking for projects, again, to demonstrate that planning consistency. And the top three, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, the Multimodal Priorities List, and the Transportation Improvement Program are going to be those sources of projects where you're going to look for a good starting point in order for you to find a project that's in there that you all have submitted as part of these planning documents, and that is moving forward through the federal process and can then also be used to leverage federal grants. So why would you select projects from an MPO adopted plan? Well, all projects seeking federal funding must be included in an adopted MPO plan. And most likely, many of the grants that you all are going to be applying for are going to require that as part of the application, you demonstrate that planning consistency between the local government and also the adopted MPO plan, whether that be the Metropolitan Transportation Plan or the Transportation Improvement Program. In addition, it avoids a lengthy plan amendment process. So if you already start with a project that's included in our Metropolitan Transportation Plan or Transportation Improvement Program, you don't have to go through an amendment process in order to get that in there. And as Paul said, if you're starting the grant planning process at the release of the NOFO, it's already too late. So there's no way you're going to be able to get your project included into our Metropolitan Transportation Plan or Transportation Improvement Program when the NOFO releases. In addition, the MPO's planning products meet all of the federal requirements, as I mentioned before, that planning consistency, they're vetted projects, they have Broward MPO board approval, they've demonstrated partner collaboration. So once again, you're starting with a great base here, talking about that sauce for the spaghetti. This is the great sauce that you want to start with. And as I mentioned before, that starting with projects in an MPO adopted plan ensures that these projects are ready to respond to the short grant application periods that we often get 6 to 12 weeks at best with the NOFOs that we've seen in the past. So here are the two sources that I've been talking about. I've mentioned the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, which in this case is Commitment 2045, and the Transportation Improvement Program. So the difference between the two is that the Metropolitan Transportation Plan is our 25-year cost feasible long-range plan. It includes 6 funding programs, and it specifies regionally significant projects. Now, these projects are not necessarily all funded per se. They are attached to a funding forecast that we receive from the federal government, and we assume that all else being equal, that there will be a reasonable amount of funding based on the funding timeframe that project can be implemented. Now, on the short-term side, we do have our Transportation Improvement Program, which is a 5-year fiscally constrained program, and it is a subset of the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. So instead of it being 25 years, it is a 5-year fiscally constrained plan. And I would liken this more to a capital improvement program or a city improvement program, as many of the locals have, right? This is where you're actually saying, these are the dollars that we're going to spend on this project, and these are committed funds. So this plan can actually include both non-regionally significant projects and regionally significant projects. So local projects can actually end up here in the Transportation Improvement Program. Starting with the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, the 25-year funding program, I just wanted to give a quick overview of the 6 funding programs that we have included within the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. We have a roadway transit, transportation system management and operations / safety program, and then our competitive grant programs, our Complete Streets and Localized Initiatives program, Complete Streets Master Plan, and Mobility Hub. Now, something to distinguish here is that the roadway and transit program of the plan as adopted has discrete projects. So this is where you're going to find your regionally significant projects, your large arterial expansions, your large intersection projects, large transit projects such as like Tri-Rail Rolling Stock, for example. That is going to be shown as a discrete project within the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. However, the other 4 funding programs are more programmatic in nature, and we don't necessarily have discrete projects within those programs. They refer to the respective funding program for that project list. So for example, with the Broward MPO's Complete Streets Master Plan, we have a list of projects that were identified through that planning effort, and those projects are incorporated by reference into the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. So looking at the range of different options you have here, you likely may have a project in the roadway program and in one of these competitive grant programs, and we would work with you then to make sure that we properly identify that program through the Metropolitan Transportation Plan and through the grant application. So if it does come from one of our more programmatic based plans, we can say, look, this program or this project was identified as part of the Complete Streets Master Plan, and it is included within the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, therefore demonstrating that planning consistency. Now, shifting gears over to the Transportation Improvement Program, as I mentioned before, this program is updated annually with a new 5-year fiscally constrained plan, and it includes all projects that are going to be funded with state and federal funds. As I mentioned before, it can include non-regionally significant local projects with dedicated local funding from a capital improvement plan or a locally adopted budget. And this document is also reviewed for planning consistency. Now, we often at the Broward MPO, as part of the annual update cycle to the Transportation Improvement Program, we will send out a notice to our local governments and say, are there any local projects that are funded within a capital improvement plan and have dedicated local dollars assigned to the project? Would you like to include this project into the Transportation Improvement Program for this cycle? And the reason why we do that is so that if you're looking to pursue federal grants, you can show that all of those local funds are included within the Transportation Improvement Program, and that you can demonstrate that planning consistency at the federal level with an MPO approved document. Again, that's in the Transportation Improvement Program. So what happens if your project is not in an MPO adopted plan? Now, this is obviously not the ideal situation. We want you all to start with a project that is in one of the MPO adopted plans, again, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan or the Transportation Improvement Program. But let's say that your city or the county has a high local priority that has come up recently within the past couple of years, and you say this has got to get into one of the MPO adopted plans. What is the process for doing that? So I'm going to give a quick overview of how you go about amending a project into one of these 2 plans. So very quickly, I'm just going to go through the federal definition of what an amendment means, and I'm going to gray out the stuff that's really not important and simply say that an amendment involves a major change to a project included in an MTP, TIP, or State Transportation Improvement Program, and then includes the addition or deletion of a project. The last part is very important because an amendment is a revision that requires public review and redemonstration of fiscal constraint. This is why I said this process takes a very long time. We need a minimum of 4 to 5 months in order to get this process completed in order to amend a project into one of these plans. Hence why starting with a project in one of the plans is the best solution, especially if you're looking to pursue a grant in a short time frame. So once again, referring back to our funding programs and doing an amendment as part of the MTP, I can tell you 100% that in the roadway and transit program, because we do have a discrete list of projects, if you're going to add a project into one of those 2 programs, it is definitely going to require an MTP amendment because we are adding a project that is regionally significant into the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. Now, with the other programs, such as the Complete Streets and Other Localized Initiatives or the Complete Streets Master Plan, we may require an amendment. And that's something that we're going to have to decide when you come and meet with us to discuss an amendment process, because depending on how regionally significant the project is or how we plan to show that project within the funding programs, we do want to make sure that we review whether that project is going to need an amendment or not. So you'll see later on in the process that we ask for you all to sit down with us before requesting an MTP amendment in any one of these programs. And the reason why we do that is to make this determination. So very high level on the MTP amendment decision-making process. you're starting here with your locally or your local or county proposed project. And the first question that we're going to have to ask ourselves, is the project regionally significant? Meaning, does it belong in one of the roadway or transit programs? If the answer is yes, then there's a couple of different routes that that project can go. After we've answered the question of it being regionally significant as a yes, we then are going to turn to the local partner and say, does that project have any funding tied to it? Well, if it's got no funding tied to it, it's going to go straight into the MTP needs plan, and that can actually be a modification, which goes a little bit quicker. However, in the case of many grant applications, you're already going to have some local funding attached to this project. And that then is going to determine whether that project is partially funded with local funds or whether it's fully funded with local funds. And if it is partially funded with local funds, then that goes into the MTP illustrative plan, and that is going to require an amendment. However, if it is fully funded and you're simply looking to replace some of the local funds with federal funds, we can put that into the MTP cost feasible plan, and that will also require an amendment. Now, if the project is not regionally significant, we will make that determination with you all. We will then make sure that the project itself meets the MPO's program ready criteria, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. And there is the possibility then of amending that project directly into the transportation improvement program with the appropriate locally funded phases. Now, I'm going to say this is a lot of information here, but one of the reasons why we present this is to show you all that it's so important to meet with the MPO before you pursue an amendment, because there are so many strings attached and there's so many little details that we have to go through in order to make this determination. And that's why I have the asterisk on top of the slide here, because we do have to decide this on a case-by-case basis. And that's why we want you to meet with us if you are looking to pursue an amendment. And again, why this process takes a lot of time, in addition to the time that you need in order then to draft the grant proposal and apply for the grant. So again, I'm going to stress, please start with the projects in our MPO adopted plans before you pursue amending a project into one of our plans. So I mentioned the MPO program ready criteria. That is one of the requirements in order to conduct an MTP amendment or a TIP amendment. For the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, we require that a formal written request for an MTP amendment be provided by November 10th every year. It's only an annual cycle. We do it once a year. So we do request that your project come with a formal letter from your director to the MPO requesting this project to be amended by November 10th. That's after you've had a meeting with us. And then again, as I mentioned, the program ready criteria here, where the project needs to demonstrate that it has a scope of work, a good cost estimate, that you've demonstrated partner collaboration, both with partner agencies and also the public, and that the project comes with a resolution of support from your commission supporting the project as well. The financial feasibility and MTP project prioritization is going to be led by us, because the Metropolitan Transportation Plan does have a project prioritization criteria that is included with it. So just because you're amending this project into the MTP and you may be pursuing, say, MPO attributable funding, that still would then have to go through a project prioritization criteria and would have to be ranked as a result. Now, if that project is simply pursuing grant funding and you have locally funded phases attached to it, we would then probably forego this step, and it would end up in the MTP illustrative plan or in a different section of the MTP cost feasible plan. So very quick high level, and this is my last slide here. The MTP amendment request process, step number one is always a staff level coordination meeting with the MPO and the project sponsor, and a potential presentation to the MPO board. We want to make sure that the MPO board is supportive of the project. As Paul mentioned before, we all want to be rooting and batting for the same project here in the region. So if there is something that from the get-go is objectionable to the region or to the MPO board, we want that to come up in step number one, rather than when we've incorporated the project into our MPO adopted plans and it's getting ready to go for a grant application. Second, the project sponsor must identify the funding amount and type in an adopted local budget. Again, this goes back to determining whether the project ends up in the MTP illustrative or MTP cost feasible plan. We do need proof of the local funds that are going to be used to match the federal grant funds in a locally adopted budget. Again, that's for planning consistency. The feds look for that all the time. They want to see that the dollars match in the MPO adopted plan and then all the way down to the local plan as well. The project sponsor must then submit an MTP amendment request for projects to the MPO by November 10th. And then finally, we will evaluate the amendment request based on the proper federal and state guidance to determine the eligibility here and where it should end up within the plan. So I know I've covered a lot of ground here, but the thing that I can stress the most is that number one, always look to the MPO adopted plans for the source of a project to apply for a federal grant on. And number two, if you are looking to pursue an amendment of a project into an MPO adopted plan, that you come and meet with us first. We can help guide you through the process, but please don't think that this is something that we can do within a couple of weeks. This is something that can take upwards of, as I mentioned, 3 to 4 months. So there, and also when it comes to the MTP, it's only an annual cycle. So the idea that you constantly have to plan and be prepared for grant applications is no different in this case. So please come and meet with us and talk to us. And Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you to see if there are any questions in the chat box.
Thank you, Peter. So we had one question from Ms. Sharon Jackson from Broward County Transit. She asked a really good question about, are these infrastructure projects only? And the answer to that is infrastructure in a broad sense. So yes, we are talking about infrastructure, bridges, roads, et cetera, but then also capital. I really think that what we're looking for here is that these federal grants don't typically pay for operations and maintenance. So although you can have the matching funds to buy a fleet of buses, you do also need to have the funding to maintain them for their lifespan.
Yeah, and Paul, I'm just going to add on to that. That's an excellent question from Broward County Transit, and appreciate it, because yeah, if you are looking to buy additional capital, one of the requirements that the federal government is going to look for is that there is supporting operating and maintenance in order to support that capital. They're not interested in funding capital that cannot be maintained, and the federal grants are certainly not going to provide a dedicated source of funding for operation and maintenance. So definitely, if you are looking to apply for grant funding for capital, please make sure that within your plans, you have identified the appropriate operations and maintenance to give the federal government the confidence that if they fund the capital project, that you will be there to support it as well.
Then Peter, we have another one from Nomi Sandoval, who's asking a question about when does the process begin to include projects on the MPO plan? Okay, when does the process start?
Yep. So that's an excellent question. Specifically for the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, there's 2 cycles here that we need to be aware of, right? We update the Metropolitan Transportation Plan every 5 years. It was last adopted in December of 2019, which means that the new plan is going to be updated in December 2024. As part of every Metropolitan Transportation Plan update cycle, we include a call for projects. Now, likely that call for projects for the next update to the Metropolitan Transportation Plan is going to happen in early 2023. So I would say anywhere from January to May of 2023 is when the MPO will be announcing its call for projects for the next round of Metropolitan Transportation Plan projects and prioritization and that kind of thing. The other option is that you can pursue an amendment to the existing plan, and that is done on an annual basis. And that amendment cycle is open all year round, but the MPO staff will only begin to process an amendment after November 10th. So a local government or a county government can apply for an amendment anytime before November 10th. November 10th, that cycle closes, and we then begin to do all of the necessary vetting and analysis on those projects in order to include them in our Metropolitan Transportation Plan. If a letter comes in after the November 10th deadline, that will then be included in next year's MTP amendment cycle. And finally, we have the Transportation Improvement Program, where that call for projects happens annually, usually around the March, April, May timeframe. And that is an email that we send out to our local governments for asking for inclusion of local projects.
Thank you, Peter. So seeing no other questions in the chat, we're going to go over to our next presenter at Trans Systems. They have a lot of information they're going to deliver to you quickly. They're going to skip some slides, but these will be made available to you after the webinar is closed. Okay, and then after our friends at Trans Systems present, Jad will be fielding questions. Thank you.
Hey, good morning, Brian, Paul, and Peter. Thank you very much for sharing that information. Hopefully everybody can hear me just fine. Jad, you were going to share the slide deck on my behalf.
And Robert, while that's going on, why don't you give a brief background on yourself?
Sure, I appreciate that. So Robert Mariner, been working with Trans Systems for almost 4 years prior to working at Trans Systems. I was with the U.S. Department of Transportation for 16 years in the Office of the Secretary. So I was very fortunate enough to support 5 different secretaries, my first one being Secretary Norm Mineta, through Mary Peters, Acting Secretary Maria Sino, Secretary Ray LaHood, Anthony Fox, and most recently, before leaving in July of 2018, Secretary Elaine Chao. During that time, I stood up the Tiger Discretionary Grant Program, which is now known as the RAISE Grant Program, back in 2009 as part of the Recovery Act, and was responsible for overseeing the management and administration of that program. At the time of my departure in July of 2018, I had reviewed more than 10,000 applications. I briefed up to Secretaries LaHood, Fox, and Secretary Chao on a number of competitive grant applications, and was responsible for a little more than $9 billion in discretionary grant funding, with close to 525 projects across multiple modes of transportation that covered all 50 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands. So I bring a different perspective as far as the level of experience and exposure, both on the inside of the United States Department of Transportation, being the person who drafted the selection criteria for the original Tiger Discretionary Grant Program, which basically has carried through BUILD and now through RAISE, and then also developed the post-administration process, whereby if you're awarded a grant, if you're awarded a RAISE grant or Port Infrastructure Development Grant, CRISI, INFRA, so forth, then the policies and procedures established for the Tiger Discretionary Grant Program are basically used across the board for the department. So with that, thank you, Jad. And I think you had given me the right. So can we take it to the next slide, please? So the purpose of this session, as alluded to by Brian, Paul, as well as Peter, is to give you a pretty high level overview of what to expect for the upcoming discretionary grant pots of funding that will be hitting the street very, very quickly following the passing of, hopefully the bipartisan infrastructure bill in the very near future. I'll defer to, to my colleagues later on who, in their discussion on the advocacy part, can more than likely give a better update than I can on the status of that bipartisan infrastructure bill. So, one thing that I'll have to share immediately is, to echo Brian, Paul, and Peter, the name of the game is preparation, preparation, preparation. The worst thing that you can do is wait until a notice of funding opportunity has been published to just start the ball rolling. This is a great time to start thinking about your projects, thinking about what your priorities are for the next 12 months, for the next 24 months. So then you can start to develop a process for getting those projects into the queue and getting them in front of the team at the MPO, who can definitely assist you in developing how your project or projects might fit into that prioritization sequencing that the MPO is required to follow when selecting projects. So as Paul alluded to, we'll have a number of slides here, and I'm not going to go by each slide verbatim. I'll leave that up to you to read on your own, but I like to hit on the high points and then leave as much time available for questions and answers. So next slide, please. Next slide. So what you see before you is a typical idea of what the discretionary grant timeline is. So, from year to year, the schedule for when notices of funding opportunity are released are always based on when the appropriations are passed, because, for example, the RAISE discretionary grant program is tied to the annual operating budget. So the department is not going to release a notice of funding opportunity for the RAISE grant program until there's a full year appropriation passed. So currently the federal government is operating on a continuing resolution. So we're, anxiously waiting to see when that full year appropriation will pass. And once that passes, then not only will there be a number of grant opportunities that fall out from the Office of the Secretary, such as RAISE, but then there'll be other modal administrations that will have grant opportunities, such as, in the earlier question, the no and the low and no, the electric bus operations, bus equipment grant program offered by the Federal Transit Administration. Next slide, please. So the federal grant overview and the basics. So what I provided here is just a high level overview of what the current grant programs look like, from RAISE to INFRA, which is formerly Fast Lane, Port Infrastructure Development Grants, the ATC MTD discretionary grant program, and the automated driving systems. So there's tons of information provided for each one of these grant programs on their respective websites. So I'll leave that to you to review at your leisure. And the next couple of slides will actually provide a little more, much more detail on each of the individual programs, such as eligibility, what historical funding levels have looked like, and how to gauge your ideas on what projects you're thinking of submitting for each one of these programs. Because in many aspects, you could have a project that may qualify for not just one, but multiple programs. For example, if you have a project that impacts the Interstate 95, which is a part of the National Highway System, then that project could be eligible not just for RAISE, but it could also be eligible for the INFRA grant program, which are similar. However, the INFRA grant program, you're required, if it's a roadway project, the project is required to be included on the National Highway System or the National Highway Freight Network, or be a part of a state designated freight corridor. So typically interstate highways, that's going to be immediate. When you're talking of, state roads, county roads, then, there has to be an additional analysis to determine the level of eligibility for those roads. Next slide, please. So these are, straightforward acronyms. I'm not going to spend any time on this. Next slide, please. Actually, if we can, Jad, fast forward to, because as I mentioned, the next probably 8 or 9 slides, you can review at your leisure. It just provides, more detail and more information on the individual grant programs that are currently offered. There's no active notice of funding opportunity available at this time. However, as I mentioned, once the full year appropriation passes, then the department will start to roll out these and many other programs. And once we see what's going to happen with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the $1 trillion infrastructure bill, where $450 billion of that $1 trillion will go out via formula funds, and then there's $550 billion for a multitude of brand new as well as existing discretionary grant programs. So the 4 Ps to preparing winning discretionary grant applications is a process that I developed after my ability to have, after my experience of reviewing more than 10,000 applications and meeting with a number of, whether it's governors, mayors, county executives, public transit providers, you name it, 9 times out of 10, from 2009 until July of 2018. I led every webinar for the most part for every Tiger discretionary grant round. I led every webinar for the earlier rounds of the Fast Lane discretionary grant program, now INFRA. So a number of you are probably familiar, if not with my face, then definitely with my voice, based on my history of providing these types of webinars on behalf of the U.S. Department of Transportation. So the 4 Ps for preparing winning grant applications, are, and I understand that for the MPO, prioritization has a very specific meaning and, is a term of art used locally. However, the 4 Ps that I've created is prioritization, preparation, presentation, and promotion. And very quickly, I mean, once again, there's going to be a number of slides that can go into, much more detail. So the thought behind prioritization, that's somewhat different than or similar than what happens locally for the MPO, is assisting you in prioritizing your portfolio of projects against the pipeline of discretionary grant programs that we know are coming. So you can pick the best project for either one or multiple programs. The next step would be, the preparation. So assisting you in preparing a competitive grant application. Because one thing that, I've told grant applicants and project sponsors over the years is you have to start now. Last thing that you want to do is wait until the 11th hour, wait until the notice of funding opportunity drops, because to echo my colleagues previously, you're going to be limited to anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks to prepare a competitive grant application, which is 30 pages for a competitive grant narrative, coupled with an additional 30 plus pages for a competitive benefit cost analysis. So it's very, very beneficial for you to, start to think now of the projects that you would want to include in your pipeline, and think about how best to prepare yourself to prepare those competitive grant applications. If it means you have staff in-house, or if you have the ability to, reach out and seek some additional support from consultants to help you, prepare a competitive grant application. So then once you prioritize your projects, you've started the preparation process, then the next step is going to be presenting. So that's making sure whatever process you go through, whether you're preparing the application in-house or you've got outside support, taking advantage of the time before, as you're preparing the application, or even now, well in advance of a notice of funding opportunity, being dropped, reaching out to the U.S. Department of Transportation and introducing them to your team, especially for this being a brand new administration. Now is the perfect time to start, developing a 1 to 2 pager of what your priorities might be for the next 12 months, the next 24 months, or even the next 4 years. And, and reaching out to US DOT and sitting down, obviously right now, they're not taking any meetings in the building, so scheduling virtual calls. And that's something that I know Brian and Paul can assist you with and getting those scheduled. But it's very, very critical to be very proactive. The best advocate for your project, for your program of projects, will be you as the on-the-ground project sponsor and ultimately project manager. Then lastly is the promotion. I'll defer to my colleagues from later on, who I'm sure have a much more detailed presentation on the promotion or the advocacy side. So I'll leave that to them. So next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So to echo a few of the comments provided by Paul in his presentation, the things to really think about, and as I said, I'm not going to go verbatim because you can read these bullets on your own. One of the biggest issues that I used to see when reviewing applications is, the first thing is making sure that the project aligns well with the merit selection criteria, and more importantly, making sure that you do your due diligence to make sure you're requesting the correct amount. For example, there was 1 year for the Tiger Discretionary Grant Program where there was a minimum grant request for projects located in urbanized areas of $10 million. Well, we had a project sponsor who requested $9,500,000. So unfortunately, that grant application was immediately disqualified from further consideration. So not only should you be thinking about, making sure that your grants.gov registration is up to date and valid, making sure that your SAM ID is up to date and valid, making sure that your DUNS number is up to date and valid. And that's something that you should be doing throughout the year, especially once there is a notice of funding opportunity that drops, because I can't tell you how many times I've had to, be the bearer of bad news when project sponsors make attempt to submit an application the day of the application deadline, and they get an error message And I historically would receive calls and have to, once again, be the bearer of bad news and say, I'm sorry, because your DUNS number has expired and you didn't update it in time, that does not constitute a technical issue. So your project would be deemed ineligible, and you will not be eligible for that round of that specific discretionary grant program. Something else to keep in mind, which was alluded to briefly by Peter as well as by Paul, is project readiness. So one of the major parts of the evaluation process performed by the department is to ensure that if a project were to be awarded, will the department have a difficult time negotiating a grant agreement well in advance or right up to the obligation deadline, which will differ depending upon the round. For example, for the fiscal year 21 round of the RAISE grant program, which is currently being evaluated, the obligation deadline was September 30, 2024. The likelihood that there will be a FY22 round is almost a guarantee. And once the bipartisan infrastructure bill is passed, then my understanding is that $1 billion availability of funding could likely go up to $1.5 billion to $2 billion for the next year and subsequent years. So just keeping that in mind, that project readiness is just as important as making sure your project aligns with the merit selection criteria, making sure you have the requisite matching funds, whether they're state, county, MPO, or local funding, to match your project. And then, always be aggressive when it comes to your cost match. Yes, the minimum for projects located in urbanized areas is a 20% match. However, the department is looking for projects where they can see that where they can leverage as many, non-federal dollars against the federal match. So next slide, please. So the application format is very straightforward. So I'm not going to, spend a lot of time on this, on this slide, but the major takeaway from this slide is to make sure that you read thoroughly the published notice of funding opportunity. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've had to talk to project sponsors who unfortunately have assumed that the notice was going to be, very similar or even the same from previous rounds. But then when it came to responding to the merit selection criteria, they missed an entire section or sections of the newly published notice of funding opportunity. So that's one thing that you should definitely do, and have multiple people review it, and then you as a team should sit down collectively and make sure that there's a clear understanding of that. Another piece of advice is the department normally has webinars in many cases, multiple webinars for all of their discretionary grant programs. So take advantage of those webinars and use those webinars to ask any and all questions that may pop into your head. As I used to say when I led the webinars, no question is a bad question, because typically what happens is after sitting through a 45-minute to an hour presentation via webinar, questions will pop into your head and formulate. And then I've been in situations where there are 50, 60, 100 questions that come through, post completion of the webinar. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the application narrative is a critical part. Secondly, most critical is your benefit cost analysis. So the department, in addition to making sure that the project aligns well with the merit selection criteria, and for the narrative, the project will receive a rating. And with that rating comes an adjectival, a written narrative that each of the technical evaluators will provide to support their recommendation. There'll be a similar review by the economic analysis team if your project advances to the next tier of evaluation. So with that, let me just take a quick minute and walk through those two steps. So just because you're preparing an application as well as a BCA does not guarantee that your benefit cost analysis will be advanced. There's an average of anywhere from 600 to 750 applications that are received by the department for for the RAISE grant program, which was historically billed and previously and originally the Tiger discretionary grant program. So your project must align very, very well against the merit selection criteria to receive what they call a highly recommended rating. If your project receives a highly recommended rating, then and only then is your project advanced to the second tier of evaluation. That's where the benefit cost analysis is evaluated by the economic analysis team. And then the project readiness team will also take a look at the likelihood of, if your project once again is awarded, the likelihood of being able to meet the statutory obligation deadline by the US Department of Transportation and the appropriate modal administration who will be assigned your project depending upon the specific mode that your project falls under. So next slide, please. So I just, alluded to this. Environmental readiness is going to fall under the project readiness piece. So the project readiness team is made up primarily of a number of environmental protection specialists who will go through and make a quick determination on if you assume that you need a categorical exclusion to cover your compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, then the project readiness team will make a determination if it's in fact a low risk, a medium risk, or a high risk for complying with NEPA. Because as you can imagine, project readiness becomes a major critical piece when trying to meet the statutory obligation deadline. Because if you have an environmental impact statement, for example, that could take you a year and a half, 2 years before you even have a decision document to allow the department to fund the program. So the name of the game is, if you have a very complex project that required an EA or an EIS, my recommendation is to have all of that completed, have your decision document, include that as a part of your appendices, or just attach a link to those documents and within your application narrative. Or if you're confident that all you're going to need is a categorical exclusion, then document that as much as possible. And if at all possible, include a CE checklist with the submitted application. So next slide, please. So similarly to the application narrative, as well as the competitive benefit cost analysis, where the goal for the BCA is to have your BCR or your benefit cost ratio in advance of, at a minimum of 1 to 1, your BCR. But other things to be considered are if your project requires any right-of-way acquisition. All of this will come into play when the project readiness team is determining, okay, can we in fact obligate the funding within the statutory obligation deadline? Because in order to sign and execute a grant agreement, all of your pre-construction activities are required to be completed. So as a few of the boxes state, any outstanding state and local planning approvals. Peter did a great job with talking about getting projects added to the local plan. Now, one thing that I will say that's slightly different from Peter's presentation is there's no requirement in order to submit the application if your project is not included in the plan. However, you have to keep in mind, if you are awarded, then you have to be mindful of all of the steps that Peter presented in order to be able to make sure that your project is included on the appropriate plan or plans to allow the department to obligate the funding within the statutory obligation deadline. Similarly, any outstanding environmental clearances, final design needs to be completed, any railroad implementation agreement. So that's a major high hurdle when, in many instances, if you have projects that cross, active railroads. As you can imagine, railroads, they basically do what they want, and they can draw out your process. So if at all possible, having agreements in place with the appropriate railroad or railroads, can definitely speed up your review process and your negotiations process if you were to submit an application including, crossing of a railroad, a grade separation project, or on the backside when it comes to, if you're awarded a project, then it gives the department greater confidence that they'll be able to negotiate within a timely manner. So next slide. So as I alluded to, and it's something that Paul mentioned, it's very, very important to confirm your grants.gov registration username and password is up to date. Each grants.gov username and password has to designate an authorized organization's representative or an AOR. Please, please, please make sure that you have a backup for that person. Once again, I can't tell you how many times I've had project sponsors attempt to submit an application, and the application is not submitted by the appropriate AOR, and then they're scrambling because that AOR is either on vacation, is out of the country, and then they're unfortunately not able to submit the application to meet the application deadline. So it's very, very critical to make sure grants.gov username and password are up to date and valid, DUNS, your SAM ID, you have, if at all possible, multiple AORs, or whoever's going to be responsible for submitting the application has the appropriate AOR login information, because it has to be a specific username, password, and email address and address, as well as phone number and contact information for it to be submitted successfully. Next slide. So as I alluded to, the 4 Ps for preparing winning grant applications, the evaluation selection process is very straightforward. As I mentioned, in order for your project to advance to the economic analysis team and the project readiness team, it must align very well with the technical evaluation teams. So those are typically made up of career staff from multiple modes within the department to review the technical merits of the application. All of that happens post advancement from the intake processing team that will review every submitted application for basic eligibility. Once your projects are advanced through those initial 4 steps, they advance to what's called the senior review team, which is made up of the senior political staff from the Office of the Secretary and all of the modal administration, all the modal administrators who have oversight responsibility for the appropriate mode, for the appropriate grant program, excuse me. For example, Federal Highways, Federal Transit, Federal Railroad, and the Maritime Administration are the 4 major ones that will, have the purview over, any and or all of these discretionary grant programs based on projects that are awarded by the Secretary. And then the last step is, once projects are reviewed, analyzed, and winnowed down by the senior review team, there's a list of projects that are advanced to the Secretary for his consideration and ultimately his suggestions and his recommendation. One thing to keep in mind is, at the end of the day, the Secretary of Transportation has the discretion to select the projects that he deems he would like that meet the administration's goals and that meets his goals for the specific program and for that specific round. So next slide, please. So federal grant award expectations, I'll go through this very quickly, and then we can shift to any Q&A that might come up, so there's time for my colleagues on the advocacy side. So if your project is awarded, then let's use this round of the fiscal year 21 RAISE grant program. So RAISE is currently being evaluated, and recent conversations with teams at the U.S. Department of Transportation, the department is slated to make the announcements no later than November 22nd, which, per the statute that authorized the RAISE program, the department will have to notify members of Congress at a minimum 3 days in advance of that announcement. So the 15th or the 16th of November, the department will likely be notifying members of Congress for those projects that were selected by Secretary Buttigieg, and which will ultimately be announced on November 22nd. Once those announcements are made, projects are distributed to the appropriate modal administrations. Once the modes receive those awarded projects, they will notify within their modes all of the awarded project sponsors. They'll schedule a kickoff meeting collectively, and typically they'll start doing one-off, one-on-ones with the individual project sponsors to start the negotiations process. And, as the bullets allude to, they're very straightforward. They start the negotiations process with the target of making sure that they can sign and execute a grant agreement in advance of that statutory obligation deadline. So making sure that all pre-construction activities, final design, environmental documentation, PS&E is approved, right-of-way acquisition has already been completed and certified if it's required for your specific project. And then during that negotiations process, you will negotiate performance measures as well as performance monitoring, which comes into place once the construction is completed. During that negotiations process, if your project was not already included on the MPO's plans, then during that negotiations process, that's where you would have to aggressively pursue the inclusion of your project on the appropriate plan. So with that, next slide. This slide just provides a link to a number of resources, very straightforward. It'll take you to all of the requisite websites you can look at. You can look at all of the submitted applications, as well as you can look at all the awarded projects, especially on the RAISE grant program. There's an Excel file that includes every submitted application, and then there's a report for each awarded project. So with that, I think we should be coming up on Q&A for this segment of the presentation. And Jad wanted to see if there are any questions that I'm more than happy to answer.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robert. So we don't have any questions right now in the Q&A.
Okay.
We are going to have a general discussion period after Lori and Lisa go ahead. So if you want to stay on, and maybe there'll be some questions for you.
I'll be here.
Thank you so much, Robert.
My pleasure.
Next, we have Lisa Barkovich and Lori Hedinger from our federal advocacy team at Holland & Knight to speak about how best to promote your grant application once it's submitted, as well as touch on some of the new programs proposed in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Lori and Lisa?
Yeah, hi, good morning. Lisa Barkovic. I'm a senior policy advisor at Holland & Knight, and I have been working with local governments and transportation authorities at the firm for about 16 and a half years. And prior to that, I worked in the Florida congressional delegation for about 4.5 years. Lori?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lori Hedinger. I'm also a senior policy advisor at Holland & Knight. I've been with the firm around 10 years. I represent local governments, transportation agencies, and water utilities, and a couple port authorities. Prior to joining Holland & Knight, I worked in the Senate, serving for several Republican senators, and I served as a staff director of the Senate Environment, Public Works, Highways, and Infrastructure Subcommittee, where I had the opportunity to work on the various transportation authorizations and grants. Thanks for having us today.
So you're going to hear from us this morning on several different themes that have already kind of been talked about this morning. You actually just heard Robert talk about socializing your project priorities with the Department of Transportation. And this is a key step to understanding your political landscape prior to the grant applications coming out. So here are the steps that we think are very important in aligning up the advocacy that you need to have to be successful at the federal level. So the first thing is to identify regional and local support for your project. Does your project compete with other local regional projects? This is important because when we get to step 3 here, you'll see that if your member of Congress feels like that there are too many priorities and they have to kind of figure out which one will be their priority, having that kind of family discussion will certainly help you make your case when you are talking at the regional level. And then the other part of socializing your project is introducing your project to the to DOT prior to the solicitation opening. Get them familiar with you. They can talk to you much more freely and openly, and maybe their time that they have to give to you is not as constrained as when it can be when everybody wants to meet with them when the solicitation is open. You can also use this time, it's very valuable to get insight into the direction of the program. The criteria can change from year to year. It can change from administration to administration. And so this is a key part in helping you do all of that planning and preparation that is necessary to get your submission ready. I'm gonna keep going here, but it's just a key step. Some years, Raise, when it was billed in Tiger, there was no money set aside for planning grants. And so, understanding that landscape can help you figure out, is this project, is it going to meet that $10 million threshold that Robert mentioned? Or, is this a project that I can submit for some planning dollars? But hey, are planning grants even eligible this year? So this understanding your landscape is very important, and also from a political standpoint. We have together here a checklist that is going to, be Jad and Paul are going to share with you later. But there are kind of the to-do lists that you should, start working on, and the right time frame to do so. So your support letters, not only from your congressional delegation, but you can ask your state and local reps to also provide support letters, and from your business community. If you have a new facility that is being built next to your region, like Florida Power and Light, and you're doing something creative in terms of energy savings, like even getting them involved in your project is going to be helpful. And it's never too early to ask and never too late to ask. DOT is not saying, oh, they got this support letter a month before the solicitation opened. That doesn't matter. They are just looking to see who is lining up to be a part of this. And then once the solicitation comes out again, find the time to brief DOT. Do this during when the solicitation is open. Update if you received important feedback from them from your first meeting. Go back and tell them how you've listened to them and you've updated maybe some of what your project is trying to attempt to do. The other thing that I think from an advocacy standpoint that not many people do is engaging House and Senate appropriations staff. When Tiger was first created, the money was put into an appropriations bill and not an authorization bill. And so the appropriators really work closely with USDOT to ensure that the money is being doled out appropriately. And so I know DOT keeps the appropriation staff well apprised of how the process is going and what they're looking at. So I think that is something key, and because you locally have a couple of appropriators from the South Florida delegation, this is important because they're going to look to Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz or Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart to understand more about priorities too. So I think that is an important advocacy secret that I'm going to share with you all. And then some other important to-dos: utilizing your local leadership. Maybe your mayor is coming to Washington for the U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting, or you have a council member that will be part of National League of Cities. And if they're going to be in DC, I would utilize them and make sure that this project is on their list of talking points as they're working with the different departments and agencies and having their meetings. And then also continue to always utilize your congressional delegation outside of getting your support letters. Ask them to check in. We like to say, go ping DOT. you're telling the congressional delegation, look, call them and just ask them, how's the timing looking? How's the project faring? Just little things, to make sure that DOT knows that this project is being watched by the delegation. And then the other advocacy efforts that you can use, utilizing your social media to promote your project. If you have a lot of support lined up for it locally and it's a big priority, tweeting to US DOT about like important milestones that your project is making and how, it supports the administration's goals, I think is, something clever and helpful to do. And here's another theme, and I'm sorry, but that we're coming up on lunch and we're making me think about spaghetti on the wall again. But really what we're trying to emphasize here is how important it is to be strategic. Lori is going to talk shortly about all of the opportunities that are in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, what might be coming in the pipeline through reconciliation. And you have to really be thoughtful about what you want to ask for and what your top priorities are going to be. With so much opportunity, you don't want to go to your grant writers too and tell them they have 5 applications that they have to write, within a matter of months, because things are going to, be a little bit overwhelming. And, we continue to talk to DOT and I know they're all gearing up for maybe implementation of some of these new grant programs and how you can, how there might be some streamlining that goes into the process, but just be really thoughtful about what you're doing here, and be flexible and think about scalability. There are projects that can cost a lot of money outside of what the merit criteria asks for. So putting into your application what are, sizable bites of the apple so that DOT can understand exactly what they can help you with. Communicate often. I mean, that's just a no-brainer there, and just building partnerships. So the MPO is, very good about working with all of you on partnering on projects, and that will go a long way in terms of showing, regional support for your project. The other new opportunities that are out there outside of the infrastructure bill and possibly reconciliation, as you know, earmarks are back. That's your community project funding, congressionally directed spending. This is the first time that they're back in over 10 years. And so these are much smaller dollar amounts than the big, where raised is a minimum of 10 million for a construction project. So maybe you can, think about that flexibility and scalability and use an earmark instead of maybe a competitive grant. So then I'm going to turn this over to Lori, as I mentioned, as we're looking forward on the infrastructure and Build Back Better.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I want to give a quick overview of where the reconciliation, and which is also called Build Back Better. And as a reminder, this is a human infrastructure plan that the president is working on with Senate and House Democratic leadership. And then the Investment and Jobs Act, Investment, Infrastructure and Jobs Act, the name has been changed about 4 or 5 times now, is the physical, normal, traditional infrastructure that Paul referenced earlier on in this presentation. So right now, the infrastructure bill has passed the Senate and is awaiting to pass the House. They have delayed the vote because the progressive members in the House wanted to see text for the reconciliation bill first before voting on infrastructure. Lisa and I just got a note a couple minutes ago that the bill is going to go to the House Rules Committee. This committee determines the amendments that are allowed to the bill, what kind of amendments, how many amendments, and then the time frame too. So fingers crossed that will go through the committee today. And I know the speaker's goal was to pass both of these bills tomorrow. The infrastructure bill will say the exact same. It's not going to change at all. So once the president signs it to law, these funding levels are going to be the same. And on reconciliation, it will return back to the Senate There are a couple of DOT provisions, but we'll wait to talk about that later because they certainly could change, as you've seen in the news with Senators Manchin and Sinema asking for a lower funding cost. Do you mind, Jag, going to the previous slide again?
I'm sorry, Lori, that was me. Let me.
And while she's doing that, just I want to touch on the two programs Robert said that are very popular. The RAISE program, which of course what used to be Tiger and Build, there is $7.5 billion available over 5 years. Traditionally, there's only been $1 billion. This is an over 70% increase over current funding. So you'll need to make sure, and I know the MPO is coordinating with you, that you take advantage of this. And for the INFRA program, Projects for Regional National Significance, which I know many people in this region, particularly the port, have been pursuing, there is a 78% increase. There's going to be $8 billion over 5 years. And this is going to make it easier for you. You know the funding is going to be there. So if you're not ready next year, you have 4 more years to apply. And then I will quickly go through some new opportunities. For the first time ever, the Transportation Infrastructure Bill includes a resiliency title. And this was supported on both sides of the aisle. As the MPO has spoken to DOT, as DOT told them, these grants were perfect for the Broward region. The first grant is called Protecting Resiliency Operations for Transportation Efficient and Cost Savings Transportation Grant, otherwise known as PROTECT. And this program was created to help local governments and MPOs make sure their transportation projects are more resilient and to protect them against weather events such as tornadoes and hurricanes. The next program is Carbon Reduction Program. This is something that FDOT will give over to the MPO, and the MPO can be give it out to local governments for competitive grants. And this is the type of thing they could use it for ITS, traffic light, signalization. And then the next one is Healthy Streets Program. This is a new competitive grant program, which all of you are eligible to apply for. And what is great about this program, for the first time, it provides federal funding to provide tree canopies. And then lastly on the slide, there are 2 new electric vehicle programs. The first one is through grants that local governments and the MPO are eligible for. And then the second one will be through FDOT, and FDOT will deploy that funding in each of the regions. Next slide.
Sorry.
Okay. I'll just start right quick. There are several programs, that's okay. For the first time for Vision Zero, which I know has always been a priority for this region, you've done an excellent job using your current federal formula dollars, and you're successful with a Tiger grant over a couple of years ago. This has definitely been a priority for the region, and we're very successful in including 2 programs for that. Another program important to this region is a railroad crossing elimination competitive grant program. Previously, there was no federal funding for this. As you know, these grade crossings are super expensive. And then lastly, it's congestion relief, which I just explained. And we'll go to the next one and talk about Vision Zero. And the 2 Vision Zero programs are the Safe Streets and Roads for All. It's a lot of money, $6 billion over 5 years. And you can use this to actually implement your Vision Zero plans and also to construct and study these projects. And then lastly, there's stopping threats on pedestrians. And this can be used for new bollards that are in areas where there are a lot of pedestrians to protect them against terrorist events or extreme weather. And then lastly, there's a brand new bridge grant program. This previously did not exist either. The first one will be formulas through FDOT, and the second will be competitive, which all of you are eligible for. Any questions? Or we could do the questions at the end, Chad, whatever works for y'all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lori and Lisa. So right now we don't have any questions, but again, we'll have an open discussion period. So for now, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Cavarese as some closing comments. And then that'll give you guys, anybody, time to put in any questions they'd like. We still have all of our presenters online. So if you have any questions for any of the speakers, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. Paul?
Thank you, Jed, and thank you everyone for staying on. I know this was a lot of information to throw you all at once. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers for staying on. And I just want to remind you, if you have any questions specifically about any sort of grant programs or do your projects align or working with the MPO, my contact information is available. I also want to let everybody know that after today's webinar, a recording and all the presentations will be available on the Broward MPO website through our agendas, same way you access the MPO board agendas. Okay, and then also following this webinar and throughout the coming weeks, we'll be sending several surveys out to assess our regional needs, both in project identification and your grants management capacity, and looking at how the MPO can help supplement or complement the regional efforts. And really, we look forward to bringing funding back to Broward County. We are a donor county with regards to the federal government, and we really need to start bringing that money back home so we can build the infrastructure that we need. So I don't see any questions in the Q&A, and looks like we can end exactly at 12. So thank you everybody for staying on. I have one from Mr. Greg Gale. Okay. He's asking, what guidance will you provide local governments concerning using products that are carbon neutral? Mr. Gale, it's a very specific question, and we'd like to work with on something like that specific. We'd like to work with each municipality individually, or we can talk offline. So I really appreciate the question. And then
I was just going to say, Paul, I was going to say the new Protect grant program does allow to use these types of materials. So that would be eligible as they work with you.
And I want to tell everyone again that yes, these slides, the presentations, the recording will be available through the Broward MPO website. We'll be making them available this afternoon. And if you have any questions on very specific projects, please reach out, email us, and we'll try to pair up your project with any sort of available grants and look at what resources are available to you.
Azita has a question. Are any grants available for seawall construction?
Zita,
I'm sorry, Laura.
oh, I'm sorry. I'll say in the new programs, and Robert, I'll let you discuss the
Sure.
existing programs. I do think Protect is eligible, but I need to check on that because traditionally these types of projects go through the Army Corps of Engineers.
Yeah, so just to add to Lori's answer, for the new grant programs, we'll, obviously you have to wait until one, they pass, and two, what the actual eligibilities will be as provided by the department. But lastly, to the specific question, yes, the Port Infrastructure Development Grant Program that's currently, it's currently being evaluated for the fiscal year 21 round. That's a program that's eligible for seawall construction, as well as RAISE grants would be eligible for seawall construction. One thing to be mindful of, on any port or maritime program is, dredging is not eligible under Port Infrastructure Development Grants, nor under RAISE, nor under infra. So seawall construction, as long as it's, activity up against an active port, a berth or a wharf, those would be eligible activities for discretionary grants.
Thanks, Robert. And just to add, this infrastructure bill we're discussing, there's $2.25 billion over the next 5 years, which is a significant increase over current funding.
So thank you for that. And then Azita, these were very broad answers. So if you have anything more specific or there's specific areas, I think that's where we can really get in depth on how this applies to your particular need. We have another one from Misa Herrera asking, are there LMI restrictions associated to these federal grants?
Paul, excuse my ignorance. Can you tell me what LMI stands for? I'm sorry, I've spent too much time in DC. So
I was hoping you knew that because that's the first time I saw those letters put together.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with what LMI stands for. Oh, it's HUD related.
HUD related.
Okay, can you spell out the acronym? I mean, that might be helpful. So typically the department tries its best when, okay, low and moderate income. So it's not going to, so on the USDOT side, they're not going to have a specific low and moderate income, requirement. However, for this administration, racial equity, low income and minority populations is something that this administration has included as part of their overarching goals for projects that impact those communities, as well as providing increased access, additional modal choice, and connectivity to, once again, low income and minority populations. So I apologize, I wasn't familiar with the LMI term, but hopefully that answers your question. And all of that is normally spelled out very clearly in the published notice of funding opportunities.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Looks like we don't have any more questions. We're about 5 minutes over time. So thank you all very much for attending. We had a great turnout today and some great discussions. Again, this recording and the full presentation will be on our website, and we'll be emailing out links to it for everyone as well. So thank you all so much from the Broward MPO. We really appreciate it, and we plan on doing more of these workshops throughout the year. Thank you all for attending.